I'm Elliot Chodoff, and welcome to Conflict Uncovered, your go-to podcast for in-depth analysis on the complex and dynamic conflicts shaping the Middle East, Israel, and the world. Join us as we delve into the latest developments, historical contexts, and the geopolitical forces at play. We bring you the insights you need to understand the issues that matter most. Stay informed, stay engaged, and uncover the truths behind the headlines. It's August 9th, Friday, early afternoon here in Israel, and a number of things have been going on this week, most of them in anticipation of an Iranian counterstrike after the elimination of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran, a Hezbollah counterstrike in response to the elimination of Fuad Shukr in Beirut. But the really interesting news of the week that has far-reaching ramifications is the Hamas Shura Council, their Supreme Council decision to appoint Yechia Sinwar as the new leader of Hamas in place of Ismail Haniyeh. Now, before we get into who Sinwar is, and his name should be familiar to anybody who's been following, he's the guy down in the tunnels holding the hostages, the man behind the October 7th savage attack on Israel. A little bit of what it means in general to the organization and to the world, who this guy is, and understanding what his leadership really means. And finally, what the world doesn't understand in their attempts to somehow pull him out from under the mess that he created and maybe somehow rehabilitate him, even though that's not what they say they want to do. So first of all, the most important thing from a Hamas perspective is that the mask has been removed from Hamas and its leadership. Up until Ismail Haniyeh was eliminated in Tehran, he was the head of the so-called political bureau of Hamas. Yechia Sinwar was the head of the Gaza branch. Mohammed Def, who we took out a few weeks ago, was the head of the so-called military wing. And the idea that there was this multi-tiered, multi-department organization pulling in different ways and somehow synthesizing was part of the mythology of Hamas. Along with it, the idea that Ismail Haniyeh was somehow a moderate pragmatist, easier to deal with, the guy you wanted to make the deal with. Well, Yechia Sinwar was the hardline fanatic who was trying to hold things up, but hopefully the moderate, pragmatic leadership in Qatar, living in their luxury hotel with their multi-billions in the bank, would somehow have an effect on him. Now, the reality is that throughout all the months of the negotiations over what Israel and the West talk about as a hostage release deal, Yechia Sinwar has been the man behind the Hamas negotiations. And Yechia Sinwar is behind the Hamas negotiations, and he really has no interest in a hostage deal. He has an interest in a deal that ends up with a Hamas victory. Now, he's been very consistent from the very, very, very beginning of the fighting, from the beginning of the Israeli offensive. What he demands as a prerequisite to any sort of an agreement is cessation of the Israeli offensive. And let's be clear, he doesn't want the end of the war. He wants the end of the Israeli offensive. The war will end for Sinwar when Israel is eliminated. The war goes on as far as he's concerned. But the end of the Israeli offensive that is costing him, his organization, and his people an enormous amount in physical damage, deaths, injury, destruction. He wants a full withdrawal of Israeli troops, in other words, returning the Gaza Strip to the rule of Hamas, and along with that, the withdrawal of Israeli forces from what is called the Philadelphia corridor, meaning the corridor along the Egyptian border with Gaza, the lifeline of Hamas, under which tunnels large enough for trucks to go through have been operating up until the last few months when Israel took the corridor and cut off that lifeline. Hamas has been very clear under Sinwar. This is what they want, and they haven't moved an inch. Hania, who was playing good cop to Sinwar's bad cop, would go to the negotiations or send representatives, and they would say things, well, we're willing to compromise. We'll change the words this way. We'll change the words that way. They would come through and say, look, we have an agreement. We've agreed to the American and Israeli demands with a few minor changes. It's reminiscent of an old Dry Bones, for those who are familiar with the cartoon, where the Americans call the Israeli ambassador after the signing of an agreement and saying, we just want to make some minor cosmetic changes in paragraph 2, where it says, no, not, and never. Just change it to yes, will, and now. Just cosmetic. The idea that Israel should compromise, and this is the Western and particularly the American idea, in order to come to an agreement, basically means that Israel should surrender to Sinwar's demands. Now, it was made easier when Hania was around because, again, they were playing the good cop, bad cop. Hania would say, yes, we have an agreement. And then Sinwar would say, well, no, not exactly. You haven't really given me everything I wanted yet. Now that Hania is out of the picture, Sinwar is upfront, clear, directly in control. And it's interesting, there was a report the other day, Hamas has hardened its demands now that Hania is gone and Sinwar is running things. Hamas hasn't hardened its demands. It's simply stating them much more clearly because Sinwar doesn't like to play those kind of diplomatic games. He's being very straightforward, very upfront, got to give the guy credit for something. And he says there will be no deal until there's a full Israeli withdrawal and a return of the Strip to Hamas. If he's not saying it in those words, that's exactly what he means. Now, who is this guy? He's in his early 60s. He was born in Khan Yunis, studied in the Islamic University. That's his childhood, young adulthood. Found himself in Israeli prison in the 1980s and ultimately became a high-ranking operator in Hamas. But before that, he was in charge of dealing with collaborators, that is, Palestinian collaborators who were suspected of dealing with Israel. And for that, he came to be known among the Palestinians as the Butcher of Khan Yunis. And he ultimately ended up serving or being sentenced to 4 life terms for killing 2 Israeli soldiers and killing 2 Palestinians, one of which he admitted to strangling with his own hands. He's a torturer. I wouldn't call him a hardliner. He's the face of Hamas. And killing, murder, rape, hostage-taking, hostage-killing, body snatching is all part and parcel of who Sinwar was and who Sinwar is. He was the highest-ranking Palestinian prisoner released in the Gilad Shalit deal, and he incidentally was one of the negotiators of the Shalit deal up until he bucked the Hamas leadership, who were willing to deal with giving back Shalit for over 1,000 Palestinian prisoners, including some heavy ones like himself. But he wanted to hold out for even more. They wanted to take the prisoners and run. As a result, he ended up in solitary confinement and out of the negotiation, but he was released. And there's a deep lesson in this in terms of who gets released in a deal, because that's how Sinwar gets to be where he is today. He also learned, as a result of that deal, how important hostages are to Israel and raised the value of hostage-taking to the point of what we saw on October 7th. So that's Yechia Sinwar, of course, the man behind October 7th and the man behind Hamas today, still running around in the tunnels under Khan Yunis, presumably, and very much in the fight and willing to continue. I'm going to come back to that in a moment because the misunderstanding of what that means is leading the West, and the United States in particular, down the path of a fantasy that runs in the face of the Yechia Sinwar reality. America, along with Egypt and Qatar, are planning a summit next week to work out the grand deal. The hostage release, which, by the way, Sinwar has absolutely no intention of releasing all the hostages, but at least some of them. He doesn't need to hold that many. He learned what holding one is worth when he was released in the Shalit deal. A ceasefire and presumably an ultimate withdrawal of Israel from Gaza and rebuilding of Gaza. In other words, a Hamas victory. And as a result, believing Hezbollah that once there's a ceasefire in Gaza, they'll stop shooting, which I place very, very little credibility to. And with that, preempt and prevent not only the Hezbollah counterstrike for the elimination of Fuad Shukr, but also the Iranian strike for the taking out of Hania in Tehran. The only problem with this fantasy is that Sinwar wants this war. Part of his grand strategy, going back to October 7th, was what was called the unification of the resistance fronts. And a Hezbollah attack on Israel, an Iranian attack on Israel, the Houthi attack on Israel, an uprising led by Hamas in the West Bank against Israel, of course, the Iraqi and Syrian militias attacking Israel. That is his grand plan for victory. Now, Sinwar has shown himself to be a reasonably clever operator, if brutal and at least giving indications of being a psychopath. But that doesn't mean he's stupid. Why on earth would he agree to a deal to end the war or end the fighting, end the Israeli offensive, and possibly short-circuit an Iranian and Hezbollah strike that could lead to a regional war, when regional war is exactly what he wants? So one wonders what leaders in the United States and Europe, but particularly the United States, are thinking. What are they thinking in the White House? And I don't just mean the president, I mean his advisors, who should certainly know better. The State Department, who've gotten it wrong consistently from the very beginning. And the Defense Department, and whether they have a say in it, and do they really believe that they can cut deals with murderous terrorist organizations and with that bring peace in our time. I'll end with this. As I said, Friday afternoon, August 9th, here in Israel, and hopefully we'll be back on next week, and with wishing everybody from here a Shabbat Shalom, a good Shabbat from the Galilee. Thank you for listening to Conflict Uncovered. As always, it's been another rough day in the Middle East. We hope you found this episode insightful and engaging. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, share and recommend with your friends, and review our podcast on your favorite platform. For more in-depth analysis and exclusive content, join our community and follow us on social media. Stay tuned for our next episode as we continue to explore the critical issues shaping the Middle East and the world. Until next time, stay informed and stay safe.